Hello again, and welcome to the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. As always, I'm Rob Nelson.
And I'm Mike Bachov. And hey, Rob, if you want to see a puppet show minus the puppets, I'd like to see a show of hands.
I'm going to tell you to talk to the hand after that one.
It's a little abstract. You got to think about it for a second. La, 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 la.
Exactly. Well, as Mike sort of pointed out, we are talking about the history of puppetry today on the podcast. It's a subject that maybe you don't think about when you think about topics in history. But I think we got into some pretty good and interesting conversations today.
Yeah, it's one of those things that when it was proposed, I was like, I'm not sure kind of how this ties in. But once you kind of get into the research, puppetry has existed almost as long as cave paintings. I mean, it's one of those art forms that's just been around forever.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of forms that people probably won't be expecting. We delve into everything from CGI to Punch and Judy shows to animated feature films of the recent years. All of those things incorporate some form of puppetry, and those are the topics that we covered this time.
Yep, and then in the second segment, we talked to our very own Karlie Cremers, who, we're going to spoil it for you, is the voice and the puppeteer and the creator of Scout, our youth ambassador. And she gives us some really interesting insight on how that program within Stuhr Museum came about.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed both segments, and we hope you do as well. Welcome to another edition of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. I'm joined today by Carrie Stouffer and Sam Stump, experts here from Stuhr Museum. And today we're going to talk about puppetry.
Puppetry. I don't know that we could say we're experts in puppetry. Just want to point that out.
Definitely not.
I think we've all kind of just learned through osmosis, but also our own research about some more of the fun elements of it, and maybe things people don't necessarily
know about
or jump to when they first hear the word puppet.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, puppetry has gone back so far into history, and there's so many different types of puppets.
Yeah, there are. Like, going through the research of this topic, I came to the realization that I knew quite a bit more just about like TV shows that use puppetry in them and movies. So it's really interesting that that's where it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, as far back essentially as there have been people, there have been puppets of some kind. But for a common definition like that we're working with, is there anything that either of you happened upon that fits within the parameters of what is a puppet?
Right. There were several different places where that was actually a discussion about what is the definition. Is it something that represents... Basically, it's something that represents something else that moves.
Right. Yeah.
And it really is so broad. I mean, it can be a flat figure. It can be a 3D figure. It can be CGI has taken it to a whole nother level.
Right.
And so I think, it's kind of like photography. You have purists who believe that a photograph is just from the chemicals and you make it yourself, to the photograph can be whatever CGI thing you can come up with.
Right.
Puppetry, I think, has several definitions that way. But I think what boiled down for me was it's a representation that can be moved externally.
Yeah, I think that was the gist of it. For all of the different ways that you can do it, too. There are so many across the world. But I think the basis of it was that it had to be a human or animal of some sort that moves and can be manipulated.
Yeah. And not just like the kinds of puppets. Like people everyone, I think, in their life at some point has practiced puppetry, whether they know it or not.
Yeah.
If you ever sat in your room and played with a doll or an action figure and gave them voices and, moved them around a room and made them, interact with other ones, you were practicing a form of puppetry.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, I think that's something every kid can relate to, but that when I was doing my own research, that didn't really register with me until I read that. I was like, oh yeah, that's absolutely true. And then you kind of stumble along as I speak, stumbled. The more you research, you're like, wow, yeah, the puppetry is in way more areas of life than I would have ever really thought about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they talk about finger puppets, but then I also read an article that talked about that, when you use your hand and close your fingers around it and you draw the little happy face.
Yeah.
And you make it move by moving your thumb up and down. That's a puppet.
Yeah. Or on a cave wall, everyone's done some kind of bird gesture or rabbit ears or
Shadow
something.
figures.
Shadow puppetry, yeah. And there are countries that have taken that to an absolutely whole new level. It's amazing. Watching the videos of them. Where were they?
Actually, they're all over. They're South America. They're India. They're
Africa,
Vietnamese.
Europe.
Yeah.
And they're intricate. And they're usually, what's really interesting to me is that, we're talking about the fun things we do every day,
Right.
but they really start out very spiritual.
Yeah.
And relating to something that, is magical, spiritual, something about the origin story.
Yeah.
And they create these incredibly detailed flat figures, usually, with pieces carved out of it that they can then shine light through, and they have the shadow puppetry. So you see the image of the actual puppet, but you also see the shadows behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the religious aspect of it, because the word marionette actually comes from a term that means little Mary. And, as part of these, religious ceremonies or what have you, a lot of times, people would make idols of their, religious figures that had the ability to move or be animate in some way. And one of the first ones was the Virgin Mary, that they gave the ability to kind of, function and have their arms or legs move and walk in a certain way.
The nativity is a huge, puppetry. And we see that a lot in South America with the parades and the different, you have sometimes, 30 feet costumes that people portray or move around, or the Chinese New Year, skipping over a continent or so.
Right.
That can involve 3 or 4 people moving one puppet.
Absolutely.
It's definitely community, spiritually based. I don't know. One of the ones that fascinated me the most were the Vietnamese water puppets.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody ran across those.
I didn't.
But they can be like carved wooden figures,
Yep.
up to 30 pounds, and they're controlled. And they're in a pond of water that can be like 3 or 4 feet deep. And then there's a screen, and the puppeteers control them behind the screen. And what's amazing to me is that we're talking centuries of doing this, and the secret of exactly how they do it is still being kept.
That sounds about right.
So it's like a spiritual, secretive, it's even kind of a clan of people that know how to do this.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful with the music, and they use their, it really hasn't been westernized at all. It's been really kept pure. So that was really neat. If anybody has a chance to check out.
And did they say how long that's been going on in your research?
Yeah, a very long time. I don't remember the actual origin date, but yeah, several centuries.
Because I found one of the earliest recordings of a quote unquote action figure. They found a doll that had the ability of its shoulder to kind of give like a kung fu chop or something is how I pictured it. But essentially it had arms that could move and perform some kind of function. They found that underground in a Czech grave from 26,000 years ago in what is now the Czech Republic. It obviously wasn't then, but 26,000 years ago, they had some form of action figure, as it were, that, did the same thing that maybe kids today are enjoying with their action figure.
Absolutely.
So, the story of, puppetry is just as old as there are humans. And I guess there must be some kind of natural inclination on the part of humans to want to do this.
Well, I think that's very true. I think when you look at it, there is something. And I think there's a desire. It must be very innate to try and represent something, to make something move like something else, to tell a story. But then I think it kind of goes along and progresses, and that, now we're at a point where it might be tipping in an unnatural way. Think about Sesame Street. Jim Henson and all of his characters. We all grew up with something like that.
How we have toys of superheroes today, and we tell the stories of them. They thousands of years ago, they also told the stories of their superheroes. Their superheroes were their gods. They were their ancestors. To be able to either play or tell the story of that was just the same kind of concept as it is today. Whether you make up your superheroes or your superheroes are passed down from centuries, I mean, that's who you look up to. Mm-hmm. That's who you want to be like.
Right. Well, and then going into the pure entertainment, where we've got the ventriloquists and all of that going on. And then you talked about the movies, and the TV shows. I mean, Sam pointed out a couple of TV shows that I didn't even think of. Like Alf is puppetry.
Exactly.
And I was just
that's kind of one of the things I wanted to talk about, was just like that kind of natural progression of things. Especially in the modern era, like we just, in our collection, we have a Charlie McCarthy doll, that is famous somehow on the radio beginning in the 1930s, a puppetry act famous for not being in person, but actually being on the radio. And, like Howdy Doody is what I'm thinking about, or Art Carney, or, things like that become popular in the 40s and 50s on radio first and then TV. So, I mean, there's something about it that doesn't necessarily need to be physically observed also in order to be entertaining.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
It is. For some of that, a lot of it, you can attribute the entertainment aspect to a promotional photo that they would send out, and then they could put a face to the doll, and then they could understand that this is, when you put a voice to it, you can imagine the doll talking.
Sure.
So, I think that that's where the aspect comes from, is in the entertainment of a puppet being on the radio, is that you know what it looks like. You know how it's supposed to function. So you can imagine it yourself. Your brain fills in the details.
From a magazine or comic book or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, and that, whatever that is, that dissonance, or I don't know, imagination, or whatever you need to make it, I think is what then takes us kind of out into the realm of another thing we all found interesting, which is that there's a creep factor, of course.
Yeah, it can be considered very creepy.
Yeah, the actual name for the fear of dolls and or action figures, mannequins, etc., is called Automataophobia. It has that loose definition of fear of wax figures, humanoid robots of any kind, also audio animatronics, which I found to be interesting. And this kind of ties into the concept of the uncanny valley.
Yep.
It's a term that's like increasingly becoming more in vogue with movies that are, CGI utilized or animated in ways that where the characters have very, very
a lot of video games too.
Yeah, human-like but not entirely human features.
Yeah, and the concept behind that is that the more human they try to make the character, the more people typically reject what the character looks like. It's because it's that almost human, but not quite. So your brain registers that something's wrong.
Yeah.
And it registers that like either sick or something's not right, and it's not.
And it makes you want to back off.
Yeah.
It makes you want to
Get
avoid it.
There's evolutionary biologists that look into this. It's not just the casual moviegoer, but
right.
They attribute that there's like an unease, a creepiness, just an unsettling feeling at looking at some of these characters that people experience. They attribute it to the dead eyes is one of the markers. Yep. Like a skin texture that seems too fine, or too good compared to a human or whatever. And they kind of, these evolutionary biologists or people in this field of robotics, I guess, they sort of attribute this to like the evolutionary development in humans, where it's in our whole makeup to reject things that like as a safety precaution that don't quite match up with what we're expecting from a human.
Yeah, the whole biometrics idea and, relationships with the way the measurements of the body and different things and how you're attracted to and not attracted to different things.
Yeah.
It's an amazing field, and I had no idea that it was so large and so studied. And I was also surprised because as I read it, I'm like, well, I don't have a problem with puppets. It's not an issue for me. Not afraid. But then when I start looking at the examples and just the avatars and the movie Avatar, I mean, I'm like, oh yeah, that creeps me out. That one did creep me out. Like, yeah, no.
Well, I've heard the Jim Carrey remake of A Christmas Carol is one that gets cited.
Yeah,
the Polar Express also is one that gets cited. The most recent Cats is one that gets cited.
And those do kind of creep me out. I mean, when you
definitely.
actually point out examples, then you're like, oh, I get it. Yep, because I had that feeling. I had to get over it to enjoy the movie.
Right. And I think a thing that I have and that I've experienced is that as other people tell me that, the Polar Express freaks them out, it never freaked me out. Like, I never saw anything wrong, so I think my facial recognition software is broken in my head. But they're, like, the Cats movie, that totally, something's wrong there. But, like,
For a lot of reasons. Maybe that go beyond the uncanny valley. But.
Right. Whereas,
We're going to get some comments there.
If you look at, like...
Bring them on.
Well, but if you look at, like, the 1997 release of Cats, where they did the stage production and they did a lot of work on producing the stage production into a feature film, it's beautiful. So it's a big difference between the two. And there were a lot of extra things that went into the movie that are just like entirely unsavory and, made it the horror show that it is. But I watch a lot of videos about it too.
Don't hold back.
But like, going back to the movie, The Polar Express, I never had a problem with it.
It's something that's, for some reason, within our DNA as humans, is just like, maybe it's for, reproduction. Maybe it's for just like our own fight or flight mentality of, protecting our lives from the unknown or whatever. But for some reason, we just have this unease.
But what's curious, is that they're extremes. So at one hand, I mean, I'm sorry, Snuffleupagus is like, you need him in your life and you relate to him and, you feel like it's a puppet that actually kind of exists, even though he doesn't exist and yada, yada.
And yet I've met people who are terrified of him too.
Well, that's true. But there are puppets.
It's a select few though.
That, Jim Henson's creations and all of those that you can relate to, Kermit the Frog, Miss Piggy, they're part of your growing up in your life and all of that. And then on the other hand, you have something that has an actual diagnosis.
Yeah.
Right.
And so those extremes are really fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, and I one thing I remembered that I was going to say earlier was that going back to movies a little bit, when they first were producing Shrek, the first Shrek movie, like one of the pioneers in 3D animation, they found that their test screenings, kids reacted very badly to their design of Fiona because they made her too human looking. So in order to compensate for that, what they do is they tone it down a little and go back to a sort of cartoony style because people gravitate toward that more so than that human realistic look.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I mean, that's
that turned out to be one of the greatest animated movies that's come out in the last decade.
Oh, well, or 20 years. I think the first Shrek's maybe 20 years.
20 years,
or so.
The last 20 years, yeah.
But yeah, clearly even then in early 2000s, they were aware of that reaction that some people were having.
Right.
I'd like to kind of switch gears and just kind of get back to actual not real puppetry, but like the traditional sense of puppetry. One of the things I was fascinated with was the Punch and Judy acts and how old those really are. They're actually an Italian derivation that becomes English in the 17th century. 1660s is really, if you want to pinpoint a date, is about when the Punch and Judy shows come about. But what's most interesting to me is that beginning then until the present, you have these sort of puppetry mixed with ventriloquist acts that sort of take on political satire. Like the more I read about, Charlie McCarthy or Punch and Judy shows, or even somebody like Jeff Dunham today, who's a ventriloquist, through their puppet, they're able to like say what a person can't say in the discourse of society. So they let their puppet say it. And like, it's very much, the political taboo things of the day, they allow their puppet to say it. And so it's like, there's this straight line through about 400 now 50 years, 60 years of just, political satire through puppetry.
Yeah. And I bet if we investigated it further, it would go back further than that.
Oh, I'm sure.
It's just that ability to either advertise or make public opinion. The Punch and Judy shows, people talked about community members and what they were doing and what they were getting away with and who was with who and who went out where, which is something like early 19th century newspapers did.
Yeah.
Who's visiting and who's that. It was a way to talk about your community, to get information out and all of those things. Absolutely fascinating. Also fascinating, the violence.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And how that played a part in, I imagine, relieving stress. Some of them are hard for me to watch, but at the same time, I can imagine during the day that there's no other ways to have that release that, maybe all of us get from playing a video game or from watching a movie or something like that. There's a point to it.
Yeah.
And I think Punch and Judy was one of those early political, violent kind of experiments that lasted. It wasn't really an experiment. It lasted forever.
No.
Still lasts. People still do it and write new scripts.
And there's probably a line as well that kind of segues in a different direction into like the Tom and Jerry cartoons that I grew up with, or Coyote and Roadrunner, or any of those kind of cat and mouse dynamics that are, very popular everywhere. I guess the last question, because we'll pause it here and call it a day. I'd like to know, both of you as historians, do you have a favorite in your research story of puppetry? A unique puppet, a puppeteer, a story from the past about this subject?
Really, I gravitate toward, well, first of all, the water puppets, and there are life-size Japanese puppets as well that we did a little bit of research on. But I think the things that I tend to gravitate toward too are the more modern versions in TV shows. I love the Jim Henson universes and everything that went into those. The show, you can catch it on Disney Plus now too, Dinosaur. That was Jim Henson's final wish before he died, was that was created. Wow. And they're talking about bringing it back.
Wow.
But it was at the time one of the most expensive endeavors that the network had ever created. And now it would be so much easier for them to do because of the rise in technology. The Dark Crystal is an absolute favorite of mine that I just discovered within the last 2 years, and it's been around forever. I love the characters. I love the story, and they, did a revamp of that and brought it back too. There are so many things. I haven't seen it, but there's also a Taiwanese show now that came out in like 2016, and it's called Thunderbolt Fantasy, and it is entirely animated puppets.
Great.
Not animated, stop motion.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's another aspect.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about that.
Yeah, we didn't even get into that. Like the California Raisins are, a form
all
of puppetry.
Of that's considered puppetry.
Everything by those
Burton.
Early Tim Burtons. Yeah, Nightmare Before Christmas, Corpse Bride, those sorts of movies and commercials are all, claymation, a form of puppetry that we didn't even get into. So, this is what we're talking about, is just kind of,
it just goes on.
It's so wide-ranging, and to get it into a 20-minute segment is a little bit impossible.
Yeah.
Right. It's a wide expanse throughout the centuries of so many people, so many forms of puppetry that they could come up with in different cultures and what that means and represents to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Jim Henson is probably, I even if it does creep me out a little bit, they're my favorite things. I just love that. And it's amazing to me how many things I like that are considered puppetry. You know, I like The Nightmare Before Christmas. I've watched it 100 times, you know, at Christmas time and stuff, and you don't even think about it. I have to say The Labyrinth.
Oh, Labyrinth.
I mean, if you combine all of Jim Henson's puppetry with David Bowie, I don't know how you can go wrong. Right. Except you can, because I remember as a child being really afraid of the red puppets where their heads come off and they bounce the heads.
Terrifying.
It was terrifying to me, but I would always want to watch the movie, and then I would like fast forward on the old VHS past that part.
Well, those are both highly interesting examples from the modern era. I'm going to go back over 500 years to a famous example that maybe no one else is familiar with, but I think is really cool. Leonardo da Vinci created a very famous puppet of sorts as a gift to the then King of France, King Francis I, if I recall. But that in the early 16th century, so 1510, 1518, there's not exactly a date, he essentially created a animatronic lion that was a full-scale lion that was essentially a robot that had the ability to stand up, walk, open its mouth, raise its paw to its chest, open its chest, and flowers came out of its chest as a gift to the King of France. All these flowers came out of this lion's chest as the king entered the city. And it was just apparently an amazing sight. I mean, of course it was 500 years ago that this animatronic what looked like a lion.
Yeah.
It'd be amazing today.
Yeah. And
right.
It was done by this kind of counterbalance pendulum technology that would later be used in clocks. But he, used it for this lion, and it created this, amazing invention for 1518, for crying out loud.
Right.
And
that's so far advanced than even people can think of today for the types of animatronics and what did he have to work with but just his brain.
Yeah.
He didn't have examples to go by.
And the people who wrote about it, keep in mind there's not that much documentation of anything in 1518, but that multiple people wrote down that they were so enthralled by the site that, there's still a few accounts of this that exist 500 plus years later. It just denotes how significant some people were moved by seeing this genius in action, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's amazing.
But anyway, I digress because I can go on for hours, as I'm sure some of the guests know. But we're going to pause it here. And
hey, I got one more thing to add.
Yes, Carrie.
So my newest favorite puppet and my newest favorite experience is something here at Stuhr Museum, which is Scout. And so
yes.
I can't not just ignore the fact that we have the cutest and smartest little, what do we call her, mascot, ever. Animal. Who's not creepy in any sense of the way.
Let's call him friend.
Our friend, Scout.
Exactly. And Scout's going to be making an appearance on the next segment of this podcast, because when we come back, we are going to be back with the increasingly famous at Stuhr Museum, Karlie Cremers, and her invention, Scout. So stick with us and we'll be back after these words.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Mukau and Congrove Hardware Catalog Store. For the finest line of mixed paints and general hardware, visit the Mukau and Congrove Hardware Catalog Store on Depot Street, just west of the Merrick Planing Mill. Mukau and Congrove have stoves in many styles and offer supplies for both the farm and the home. They have a large selection of catalog sources and offer to be your clearinghouse for catalog orders.
And we are back with more of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. I'm joined now by Karlie Cremers, resident expert and Scout puppeteer.
That is my secret identity. Yes, for anyone that doesn't know, I am the brain, voice, and hand behind Scout the Puppet here at Stuhr Museum.
Fantastic. Karlie Cremers, thank you for being on the podcast.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here. This is a fun topic.
So I kind of want to just get going and ask you the question, how do you get into the field of puppetry? You know, it's not necessarily something that's as common as, you know, joining the basketball team or something in high school.
Yeah, it's definitely never on those career search tests that you take in grade school. But I think that a little bit of background about me is I graduated from Hastings College with degrees in theater and education. And whenever I was doing theater and auditioning for shows, I was often casted as a character actor, which when you have actors, there are character actors and straight actors. So to put that in comparison to a movie, if you think of The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy is a very relatable character, very kind of realistic. We can put ourselves in her shoes. So it's the one we can relate to. That's the straight line in all of it. And then you have all these other characters that are wacky and larger than life, like the lion and the witch and not the wardrobe. That's a different thing, but you know what I mean. And another example is like in Grease, where Sandy is very realistic. You can relate to her. And then she has that kooky friend, Frenchie, who has characteristics that make her larger than life in some ways. So for me, I was always casted as the more eccentric people. So I would be like a kooky old lady or a high school bully and all these parts that I would kind of get a little disappointed in because they were never the main characters. Sure. But it was my strength to make myself have no limitations in going into another character. And over time, I began to realize the value in that and the joy in that. So graduating from college and coming to work at the Stuhr Museum, I really wasn't planning to use any of those skills. But when we were talking about how we can relate to younger audiences, I thought back to when I used to go to Vacation Bible School during the summers. I don't remember the name of it, but there were these DVDs where it was a chipmunk that was a puppet and would go on adventures in the real world and learn about the Bible.
Okay.
Somehow they put all of that together, but we all loved it. And thinking about how kind of universal puppets are and how it's already a very relatable thing for children, especially with Sesame Street nowadays, I kind of pitched it as a joke of, haha, what if we made a puppet, blah, blah, blah. And then people kind of said that might actually work. And it was something that I was able to go into naturally because of those theater skills that I had and because of my education background of knowing how to communicate with children. And here we are. I don't think I ever purposefully entered the field. I think I created a puppet for the museum, and now I kind of absolutely love puppetry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you created Scout, who is the Stuhr Museum mascot now, has been for the last several months.
Yeah.
How do you go about selecting like what your puppet is going to look like? If for those of you not familiar, Scout is this kind of 2-foot tall orange fuzzball with a big green nose, I think, huge eyes, buck teeth.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just something that's completely, you know, when you see him, you think that's a puppet.
Yes.
But like, what goes into, you know, the thought process to make something, you know, universally register with people? It's like, yep, that's a puppet. Do you have any explanation for that, or is it just like something that came uniquely to you?
I think that my reasoning behind it was I wanted it to have a large juxtaposition to the background of Railroad Town. So I definitely, although making a puppet for a historical museum that's centered a lot on the 1890s, I didn't want to make a puppet that looked like it was from the 1890s. I wanted it to stick out and be something that a modern child can look at and kind of reflect themselves on. So even though they aren't personally experiencing the things Scout is experiencing, they can have that be their representation of going through that experience in a virtual sense. So I knew that I wanted it to have crazy colors that weren't necessarily attributed to one gender or another. And I wanted it to be really friendly and really fuzzy because kids like fuzzy, but then also, fun fact with making a puppet, the fuzzier your fabric is, the less you can see your seam lines. So
good to know.
Part of that secret. And from there, I just kind of made a sketch, and I think the orange fuzzy character that I sketched the first time is pretty much what Scout ended up looking like. I had made one puppet previously for a props class in college, but I just watched a YouTube video or two on how to make a puppet, and then Scout came alive some way or another.
That's just fantastic, I think.
It was fun.
And for those of you who don't know, again, it's just she has met with universal acclaim here at Stuhr Museum, the Scout mascot. So yeah, head over to the Stuhr Kids page and check out some of those videos the Scout has posted for us. I want to ask you more about your performance in general. You said that you don't necessarily have a background in puppetry, growing up. It's not something you were necessarily seeking out. Since you have started on with Scout here at the museum, are there puppeteers that you've looked to better your performance or, that you've learned from?
Yeah, I watched a documentary on Kevin Clash, who, for those that don't know, was basically the man that created Elmo to be the sensation that it is today. It's odd because Elmo kind of started off with having like a gruff truck driver's voice, and obviously that didn't work well.
Yeah.
And so someone just thrusted the responsibility of being the puppeteer of Elmo to Kevin Clash, who had been doing puppetry since he was a literal child and finally made it up into the Jim Henson Sesame Street world and was really excited. And he put these qualities of just a completely loving, kind, excitable child into this red fuzzy creature who just kind of took off from there. We have so many toys about that. Like Tickle Me Elmo was a crazy sensation where people trampled each other for.
The toy of several Christmases, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I just kind of look at that character a lot, where I don't want Scout to be off-brand Elmo for the Stuhr Museum, obviously.
Yeah.
But just thinking about those characteristics of a child that we want to really emulate and put that into a puppet. So yes, Scout is also caring and loving, but that's not what the main qualities of Scout are. It's the extreme mode of a hyper curious, eccentric child that's just wanting to learn everything and isn't afraid to ask all those questions that pop into Scout's brain. So figuring out how to channel that, and then also watched some Sesame Street just to hone in on how people do the puppetry, making sure that I was getting the mouth movements right, and constantly trying to figure out what all of the niches of Scout's movements are. Little shakes, little head tilts, little hand motions, trying to figure out who Scout is every time I use the puppet.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of what he sounds like, who he is, what the characteristics are of Scout. We were talking earlier in the podcast about a fear of dolls and or puppets. And I'm wondering, you're talking about Elmo's voice originally being more of a gruff truck driver.
It was odd.
It's kind of difficult to imagine now with, the voice that we've all come to know. But is there anything that you've seen in your experience of, people being afraid maybe because of the voice or because of other features of a doll?
Yes, I would say so. There are some children who are confused. I think I made a little child cry once. I definitely, when I see those reactions, I don't pursue interactions anymore. I just have Scout say, okay, that's okay. I'm sorry. Bye. And even with parents, when they're walking with their kids, some of them will just treat me like a preacher on the street and just like not make eye contact and walk really fast to get past me. So I definitely think that some of it's there. And I think it's just also really interesting to see how children interact with Scout. I think especially children nowadays aren't so used to things that are tactical and things that are there in front of them. They're so used to seeing everything on a screen or everything CGI or in cartoons, where even when we were growing up, we were more used to the idea of puppets. So I think that's extra foreign to children nowadays. And that can either make children a little apprehensive or afraid, or super excited and in awe, or I've had children just start punching Scout in the eyeballs, and I never really know what to do in that situation. I think they're just so in shock there's something there that they can touch that they just start giggling and smacking Scout on the head.
The punching thing seems unique, but it kind of reminds me of when I would used to go to like little kids' Chuck E. Cheese parties when I was that age. And like, those performers on stage that are animatronic puppets of the Chuck E. Cheese people, those things took a beating.
Yeah.
Kids would jumping all over them and, punch them in the legs. And I don't know why.
I know. I want to find a psychological study about this.
Is it worth like trying to find out if they're real or if they're, if they'll react to our abuse, I guess, or something like a human would?
Like, I wonder if it's some of that invincibility or that concept of when you beat up people in a video game, it's just all fun and games. So because Scout's not real and animatronics and puppets aren't real. You can do what you want without consequence. So that would, I guess, kind of be a darker turn to think that the subconscious of children just really want to beat people up. But
well, the other thing I'm thinking of is like, if, I'm someone who's, believe it or not, a little bit more introverted than extroverted. And to see somebody like Scout, who's just like a ball of energy, like you could not be more enthusiastic or, energized than Scout is, to be, to confront that as a kid who's maybe doesn't even know that they're introverted, but they are, can be like enough to make them want to draw in on themselves and be that shy kid and, just like not want to engage at all with it.
Which I always find to be very fair. And I try to do my best of using my experience of working with kids to read those situations. So if I see a child like that, I have Scout's voice go a little quieter and just ask the kid questions or say, hey, I really like your shoes. What's your name? Oh, are you having a good day so far?
Yeah.
So I just try to reflect the energy that they're giving to Scout and give it back to them since that's what they're comfortable with.
I think that's important, obviously.
Yeah, you don't want to be like that creepy clown that's just like in everyone's faces relentlessly. That's how children get traumatized.
Yeah.
I really don't want to traumatize any children.
No, yeah. It's a big responsibility, like in a kind of roundabout way. Anyway, that's where the fear of those sorts of things comes from, is from childhood and negative interactions with them.
Yeah.
But we've been talking primarily about children, but I want to ask you about puppetry and adults, because it seems to me that looking around our museum staff here when Scout's around, the mood in the room of looking over budget forms with a bunch of adults, just immediately picks up as soon as Scout walks in the room, and it's the thing that everyone's eyes go to, and now everyone's in a better state of mind. And I'm wondering if you have any, why is that? Why are puppets this kind of instant pick-me-up, I guess?
I really don't know. I mean, when I first pitched the idea of making a puppet and then it started becoming into a reality, I was really scared, especially because I had only been working here about 2 months and I was the fresh college grad and I didn't want to come off as, oh, this person is just bringing a puppet. That's really obnoxious and annoying. Take that out of here. But I have not ever gotten that reaction from people that work here. Whenever we're doing videos going around the museum and Scout wants to chat with someone, I've gotten such welcome responses and people just get so happy, and leaving them, you can see them smiling way more than when you started talking to them. So it's rewarding in that way, but I really couldn't give you an explanation. I don't know if it's just because it's so outside of the realm of what we experience every day, and because it's really trying to find that essence of the excitable child spirit. I also try to crack jokes and be witty, so even adults get a giggle. Jiggle?
Yeah.
So even adults get
a laugh.
Get a giggle. Yeah, maybe jiggle if they laugh hard enough. But it makes me so happy whenever people find joy in Scout, since at the root of it, whenever someone's being a puppeteer, they're putting part of themselves into that puppet. So I do have this very excitable, unfiltered squirrel brain inside of me that lots of times I'm more introverted in everyday life and I'm not going around just like screaming my excitement at everything, because that's not how adults act. But when I'm able to have Scout on my hand and the focus is all on Scout and not on me, and filtering that squirrel part of my brain into Scout and seeing Scout project that and seeing people get joy out of that, it's a very rewarding cycle.
And we've been, we're primarily focused on the visual side of things right now, talking about with kids in person or adults in person, or developing that voice and backing off and changing tone and all that stuff. That gets a little bit different when we're talking about being a puppeteer over the radio, which is a part that we talked about previously in the podcast. I'm kind of amazed by it, and I think it's probably due to the imagination of a different generation and not really having TV or video games to fall back on. So they look to the radio for their entertainment from puppets like Charlie McCarthy or Howdy Doody or those sorts of characters. But I wanted to ask Scout a question about this, if you would be so kind to indulge us.
Yeah, I'll go get Scout really quick.
So my question for Scout is, I'm wondering, he's currently a puppet on the radio, and I'm wondering if he feels the need to be seen in order to communicate with his audience.
Well, do you feel like you have to be seen?
No, I don't.
Well, there you go. I kind of just live my life, and I like to think that my voice kind of really gives people a sense of what my vibe is, you know? Like good vibes only, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Wherever I go. And I think even for listeners who have never seen what I look like ever, they're still kind of getting an idea in their brain where you said I have orange fuzz and I'm kind of a looker. I have these nice two big white teeth and really bright purple eyes. So I think that even if people don't know what I look like, either they want to know what I look like or they're just content with hearing my beautiful voice amongst the radio waves.
Yeah. It shouldn't really matter. We shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yes, Rob. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Scout.
You're welcome.
My last question is actually for Carly. So if we could have her back to the mic.
Oh, I'll go get her.
Okay. Thank you. Carly, do you have a favorite event or story in the history of puppetry? This is a history podcast, so this is how I like to close out the show.
Yeah, I think that when I was doing research about puppetry and some of the origins of puppetry in certain regions, I thought it was really entertaining about how puppetry was big with the Catholic Church in the 16th century for teaching morals, where they would have these puppet shows in church to teach about the Bible and to teach about morals. And then you had people start using puppets for things like Punch and Judy to make things that weren't so Christ-like.
Yeah.
And then the Catholic Church ended up banning puppet shows in the 18th century.
Oh, really?
So I just thought how it was a really funny turnaround of things started very much in one direction and then they ended up in another way. And I guess we have a little bit of both still today. I mean, like I said, I got inspiration from a chipmunk puppet teaching about the Bible. So there are still moral puppets.
Yeah. They banned it in the 18th century, like the Punch and Judy shows, like
just like, yeah, using puppetry as a form of entertainment.
Because it was too crass or corrupting on the minds of the youth of the day or something of that effect.
Getting a little out of hand for them.
Fantastic. I appreciate you being on the podcast. It was a great experience to talk with you and Scout.
Yeah, we both had a great time. Thanks for having us.
You bet. Join us next time on the Stuhr Crazy Podcast, where we'll be traveling yet again into the community of Grand Island, and we will be making our way to Heartland Antiques, and we'll be talking next week about the history of collecting and all things antique store, collecting, the history of what it means to be a collector, all those sorts of good things. So we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks.
Goodbye!